That's right. There's a bunch of amendments to the original bylaw. Here with me is councillor Brad Bradford with all the details. Can you tell us what happened today and what were some of those changes that were made?
We were able to make a couple of improvements to the bylaw as it was originally drafted. The first thing was the removal of the attestation requirement that essentially had places of worship have to go and demonstrate that they had been attacked or victimized before we would put protections in place. That was the wrong approach. That was removed. We're granting the safe access zones for up to a year. We've increased the bubble zone area from 20 meters, which was really, 1/5 of what other municipalities have done. That's gone up to 50 meters. So there were some proactive changes that were helpful. And look, a lot of places were able to get this done a lot faster. We haven't seen the type of leadership here in the City of Toronto. We haven't seen elected officials standing up for vulnerable communities. But today is a victory. I'm glad we were able to get something done, and hopefully we can strengthen that on a go-forward basis.
There was some concern that this infringes on the right to expression, the right to assemble. What are your thoughts on that?
Everybody has the right to expression, they have the right to assemble, but they don't have the right to hate and intimidation and violence. And, I'm happy to stand up and say that those types of hateful protests that we have seen outside of houses of worship, that's unacceptable. You don't need to harass and intimidate and threaten people when they're on their way into the mosque or when they're on their way into the synagogue or daycare. That's what these bubble zones are really intended to protect against. We've had this type of legislation on the books for many years when it comes to protecting access to abortion clinics. And so the very same people that are out criticizing bubble zones to protect places of worship would also go and defend the bubble zones around abortion clinics. And I think that's really admirable and important as well. But today we were able to get something done for the communities that have been crying out for support for 19 months, and I'm glad council was able to finally demonstrate some leadership and put something in place to protect those vulnerable residents.
When can we expect it to actually come into place?
I think this will come into a force very quickly. We passed it today at council. We're going to have to do some work to sort of stand this up and make sure that we have the resources in place from a bylaw perspective. But look, our bylaw officers and police have been dealing with a dramatic rise in hate crimes, nearly 100% since October of 2023. And so they have been out there trying to deal with this. This gives them one additional tool in their toolkit to help keep vulnerable residents here in Toronto safe. And I think that was the right thing to do.
Councillor Pasternak said that this means that bylaw officers and police officers really have to work together.
Of course, it is a municipal bylaw, so the first line of enforcement is our bylaw officer, but we always know that they work closely with the police, and there will likely need to be engagement from Toronto Police, as they have been, to help manage some of these protests. You don't have to go very far in the City of Toronto to see some of these hateful mobs, hateful protests that have been engaged in threatening behavior, intimidation, sometimes violence. That's what we need to protect against, and I think that's why so many Torontonians were frustrated, with the mayor, with council, in dragging their feet to put something like this in place when you've seen leadership in municipalities like Vaughan and Brampton and Ottawa and Oakville that were able to get to this position much faster. But as I always say, it's never too late to do the right thing, and today was a victory here for people who have been looking for safe access to places of worship here in Toronto.
Thank you so much for this, Councillor Bradford. Appreciate it. We also had a chance to speak to people who oppose the bylaw. Here's one.
There have definitely been incidents that are concerning. I'm Jewish myself, and anti-Semitism is concerning. But what's happening is that people are speaking about anti-Semitism for incidents that are not actually targeting Jewish people because they're Jewish. So some of the incidents that they've mentioned today about protesting at synagogues have been when there have been political events being hosted by those synagogues. So they weren't interrupting people who were there for worship. They were there because of the nature of the political events that were being hosted. And that's a valid reason to criticize.
So this will cost the city about over $1 million, and anyone who breaks the bylaw could face a fine of $5,000. Back to you.